For each of the plaintiffs, an officer signed what's called an affidavit of probable cause. And that's a legal document which is signed by an officer under oath, which says, this is what this person did to be arrested, this is why they were arrested, this is the crime, and here's what justifies their arrest. And these documents are important for, among other reasons, because a person can't be booked into the parish prison without this or an arrest warrant, and there were no arrest warrants. So each of the plaintiffs had one of these. Now, of course, typically an affidavit is filled out after someone has been accused of committing a crime, because you don't know what someone's going to do until they do it. An officer typically can only write down what they arrested someone for after that has happened. In these protests in July 2016, Baton Rouge Police Department did something that it testified it has never done before and never done since, which is it wrote the accusations of the crime in advance. The reason why we know this is because we have the emails that show that they wrote them in advance, circulated them by email, and then distributed them to officers on the scene. So each of the plaintiffs has an almost identical description of what they were accused of doing. But none of it was true. And in fact, several officers, 2 officers, when asked about whether the contents of these sworn documents were true, refused to answer and instead pled the fifth because they were concerned that their answers to our questions might incriminate them in a crime. Baton Rouge Police Department set up a system. They planned it in advance where certain officers were seizing people on the scene. They would then hand the arrestee off to another officer, who would then hand the arrestee off to a third officer, who would then sign the affidavits of probable cause. But by the policy of the City of Baton Rouge, there was no communication between those officers. So the last officer received a person, but had no idea what that person was accused of having done. But they still signed these affidavits of probable cause under oath, saying they did very specific things, without having any basis to know whether that was true or not. For example, you can see in here, it describes the location as 9,000 Airline Highway. That is about 5 miles away in Baton Rouge. These affidavits also say the signing officer is the one who caused the arrest, but that wasn't true for any of the arrestees. And that's one of the things that prompted officers to plead the fifth, because they acknowledged that they had known that the contents of these documents were false, but they signed them under oath anyway. That is, of course, perjury. So 2 officers acknowledged at trial that they pled the fifth to a number of questions. Questions like, did you commit perjury? Did you commit fabrication of false evidence? Did you commit false imprisonment? Defendant Willie Williams, an officer of the BRPD, did the same. This is extraordinary. In none of the careers of our legal team have we ever had a trial where there was officers pleading the fifth. And expert Robert Pousins testified that in his 35 years of experience as an officer and an expert, he had never seen officers plead the fifth in a civil trial. And pleading the fifth is a defense in a criminal case, but it can't be held against you in a criminal case. But that's not true in a civil case. In a civil case, if you plead the fifth, the jury can draw an inference that your answer would incriminate you in a crime. So not only were there officers like Willie Williams and like Jonathan Abity who were signing their name to documents they knew to be untrue, but there were also officers out there forging other officers' names. So for example, this says here, Walker, and has a badge number for Billy Walker. But Billy Walker testified at this trial and said that's not his signature, which is corroborated by the fact that in 2016, he sent a letter saying to his superior officers saying, someone is out there forging my names. He says, note that the printed and signed name on the affidavit wasn't done by me. Similarly, another officer, Rehab Simino, said that his name was forged on numerous affidavits of probable cause, and he also reported up the chain of command. But there was no investigation at all by the City of Baton Rouge or the Baton Rouge Police Department into these forgeries. Baton Rouge Police Department representative admitted that BRPD applied its punitive civil unrest policy to the protesters because of the content of their speech. Also, in many of the videos, you can see the officers, they bring in what's called a Bearcat, which is an 8-ton quasi-military vehicle. And on top of it was what's called an LRAD weapon, which is acronym for Long Range Acoustical Device. And BRPD used this weapon on the protesters, even though they had never used it before. They had done no safety training with it, did not even have a safety manual. An officer on the stand at trial described it as messing around with the weapon they were using on protesters at close range. Another dramatic moment was when a Baton Rouge Police Department Internal Affairs supervisor testified that they had not investigated any officer for any conduct related to these protests, not the forgery of documents, not the signing of false statements under oath, not excessive force, not false arrest, no investigations whatsoever, with one sole exception. BRPD officer Marcus Thompson, who said out loud, "We are violating these protesters' constitutional rights," was reported by two other officers and investigated by Internal Affairs for saying that they were violating constitutional rights. That is the only investigation. It was also dramatic that the then chief of police, Carl Dabadie, gave an advance order that every Internal Affairs investigator was to stay at the office and not go to the protests. And then one reason we think that there is significant nationwide impact of this is that a former officer, a representative of the Baton Rouge Police Department, testified that the city was not ashamed of this conduct. The police department was not ashamed of this conduct. Instead, Leach testified that he was flown around the country to other police departments, and he gave a list of police departments where he was training and debriefing other police departments in how they did it in Baton Rouge. And so these methods that were obviously unconstitutional and illegal were used to train other departments around the country.